and things like that. And then we'll get deeper into cold. I'll wait to share my screen, but I'm Karen Seaver, and you're here tonight, hopefully for a talk about weathering winter, what life does at cold temperatures. And I'm staff ecologist at the Harris Center for Conservation Education in Hancock, New Hampshire, and I've been in that position
The art picture up in the upper right
for a year. And additionally, I'm also an adjunct instructor of environmental studies at Keene State College, which is in Keene, New Hampshire. And that's where I'm zooming to you from right now. And I've taught ecology for 11 years at Keene State. And before that, I did my graduate work at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And that's where I had the opportunity to travel to Antarctica for part of my research. And before that, I grew up in Pennsylvania, where it never quite snowed enough for me. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I landed up here in New England. So I'll tell you some more stories when we get into our talk here. So this is certainly not a picture of New Hampshire. But for a minute, I in my earlier remarks, I forgot to mention what the Harris Center for Conservation Education is. Well, it's this amazing nonprofit organization that has a sort of a three-pronged mission that's tasked with conservation research, nature-based education, and also land protection. So it does a lot of work to trying to conserve tracts of land in New Hampshire that permit especially the travel of larger animals that need larger corridors. But of course, we also protect the plants and soil as well. So check out the Harris Center's website to learn more about the great work that's happening there. So this picture I took from a helicopter, and not all the pictures you'll see tonight are taken by me, but if they aren't credited, I've taken the picture. So if you have any questions about the photographs, I could tell you more about them as we go. And we're going to kind of start by talking about a little bit about cold, and especially with an emphasis on polar places, and a little bit about ice and snow dynamics. And then we'll kind of take on a broader scope and move to other regions, including local areas, where we'll talk about what local organisms are doing when winter comes. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll talk about how the forces of climate change are going to really reshape cold places and dramatically affect cold adapted organisms as the climate continues to change on our planet. Okay, so can't really talk about Antarctica without talking about some of the history, because once you go there, you just sort of get steeped in Antarctic lore. And one of these two people I'm sure you've heard of, Ernest Shackleton. He's famous for, well, not being maybe the best boat captain, but being a really good survivalist. He and his crew became marooned in pack ice off the coast of Antarctica, and they were trapped for close to 2 years. And the most amazing thing about this story is that everyone survived. So from Shackleton, we get these very inspirational quotes that are sort of pandemic applicable if you stretch your mind a little bit. Optimism is true moral courage, and the one that I really love, by endurance we conquer. And the Endurance was the name of his tall mast ship that got broken to bits by the pack ice in Antarctica. So that's a cheerier story than the other shown here, which is Robert Falcon Scott, who's a gentleman you might not have heard of before. But once you go to Antarctica, he's the real legend of at least East Antarctica. He made a number of trips to this continent, and he perished on his last trip there, where he was racing to the South Pole with Roald Amundsen, who was a Norwegian, and Scott made it to the pole, but a month behind Amundsen, after which he remarked, "Great God, this is an awful place." And it really shows the dichotomy of this landscape, of how you could sort of fall under the spell of Antarctica, but also realized that her beauty sort of intertwined with the extreme nature. And of course, Scott and nearly all of his men would perish on the return from the pole. So some of the places that I'll talk about in the talk today were first visited by Robert Scott. And he was actually the first person to set foot with his expedition team in the dry valleys that I'll talk about here in a bit. So just a little bit of Antarctic background to kind of orient us here. This is the large continent that lies in the furthest southerly latitudes. So high latitude in the southern hemisphere. And it's famous for being cold and windy. So is New Hampshire, but not quite as cold as windy. So New Hampshire holds the record for the coldest air temperature ever recorded in the early 1980s, which was on Vostok Station, which is the Russian research base, which is kind of right around here. 128 degrees Fahrenheit, negative. And by comparison, the coldest air temperature we've had here in New Hampshire was negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit. But we still hold the record for one of the windiest places on Earth here in New Hampshire. So it's sort of one of those questions you might ask yourself, you know, what's your personal limit? You know, how low of a temperature do you think you could tolerate, even with the modern accoutrements of down coats and synthetic long underwear? So of course, organisms living out in the wild don't have the benefit of such added things. So they have to survive through adaptation alone. So that's what we're mostly going to talk about tonight. So this first section of the talk is going to focus on this geographic region, the McMurdo Dry Valleys, and it's sort of tied in name to McMurdo Station, which is the United States scientific research base that is located on Ross Island. So here are some photos of what summer looks like in Antarctica. This is McMurdo Station, which is America's scientific research outpost. What we're looking at here is pretty much, you can see the scientific buildings in the back, and those are dorms. That's where we stay. And I was in Antarctica for close to 3 months, from 2008 to 2009, and the sun never set the entire time I was there. So it was quite amazing to be in such an environment. And this picture on the right is me in front of Canada Glacier at one of the field sites that I visited. And then the bottom is sort of a representative what a field camp would look like. So it's basically a trailer with solar panels and some added microscopes, scientific equipment. And if you think that looks small, you'd be right. Scientists, when we go to the field in Antarctica, we don't sleep in those trailers. We sleep in tents outside the trailers. And we get to commute from McMurdo Station across McMurdo Sound into the dry valleys, which are the only ice-free places on the continent of Antarctica. The continent of Antarctica is the largest desert on our planet. It's the coldest, driest place on our planet. And for overall a dry place, the dry valleys are even drier. It's not uncommon for in an entire year to get less than 2 inches of liquid precipitation. And that's in a year that it actually precipitates. There's many years where there's a total precipitation gap. And then you add in the katabatic winds, which are legendary in Antarctica, which often blow around most of the precipitation that does fall in this area. So that's why it almost looks like it would not be cold here, but it is. So when I was there in the summertime, average temperature that we'd experience on a given day, negative 25 C to negative 30 C. And some days we get closer to zero, but that was a pretty typical temperature. we were trained well, outfitted very well to sort of keep us safe under these conditions. And as you might imagine, this is a pretty expensive commute. So what we would do is we would typically stay out in the field for about a week's time, and then we would come back to McMurdo Station, resupply, do some work in the Fuller lab there, and then come back to the field areas to do further studies. So this is one of the more famous glaciers in Taylor Valley, called Canada Glacier. And it's definitely a plant-free moonscape where you can't see much of apparent life forms. There's no birds flying in the air. There's no bugs flying by your head. It's like complete and utter silence. But believe it or not, there are critters here. They're just really small. So we're too far away from the coast to have penguins. So the largest organisms in this environment are all microscopic dwellers of the soil. Nematodes, tardigrades, and rotifers primarily, with a few mites and some collembola or springtails mixed in. But overall, you're talking about an extremely unique trophic system where the top of the food web is a microscopic worm. Pretty remarkable. So you might ask yourself, why? Why study such a place? Well, part of it is the intrinsic value of trying to understand unique and extreme systems, but there's a lot of lessons that are applicable to wider ecosystems and even applications that go far beyond, what we think of as traditional environmental science. So one of the most valuable things about studying in this environment is because it's limited in unique ways, where there's absent photosynthesis in the terrestrial environment, it allows you to study, scientists to study, fundamental ecological processes that are hard to study elsewhere. You have to sort of, in other systems, have to do a very reductionist study in order to investigate what's naturally occurring in Antarctica. So a lot of the studies that are currently and were happening when I was there was to try to understand what effects changing climates have on soil food webs, especially ones that are based on detrital-based systems or sort of decomposer systems. So these are incredibly resilient, albeit small organisms, where of course you need a microscope to study them. You can't really see these organisms with your naked eye. The largest organisms we'd be talking about here are about 0.5 millimeter in length. So you could, if you made a tip, like a prick with your pencil, you could line up even a few nematodes there. So they're small, but incredibly mighty in their ability to survive extreme conditions. So all food webs are always confusing. So you look at this and go, whoa, there's lots of arrows there. But as food webs go, this is as simple as it gets. A system that's based on what's called in Antarctica legacy carbon. There's no plants there, at least currently there, although what's amazing is, the continents always haven't been in the same place. So if you can rewind Earth's clock about 1 billion years, there were plants on Antarctica because Antarctica was located more equatorially. But since it's been in its southerly position for about the last 500 million years, there haven't been plants on this continent. So it's a really unique environment. There is photosynthesis happening in the aquatic environments. So in the dry valleys, there's glaciers that feed into the dry valley, like the one that was behind me in that picture. Occasionally, temperatures become warm enough where those glaciers melt and meltwater streams form, and they flow into these Antarctic lakes. And some of the Antarctic lakes are hypersaline. Some of the Antarctic lakes are quite fresh, meaning very low saline content. So there are, amazingly, some photosynthetic algae and cyanobacteria that can persist in some of those aquatic systems, but in the terrestrial systems themselves, they're based on decomposition. So you have your bacteria and your fungal microbes that are forming the basis of this food web, and all the other somewhat larger animals are predicated upon those, and the higher trophic levels are largely eating the decomposers, not eating the bits of material that get blown in themselves. They're largely feeding off of the bacteria and the fungi. So if the bacteria and the fungi are affected by a changing climate, your upper trophic levels are as well. So that's something that we see not only in this system, but in other systems, even like our own in a temperate forest. So there's a lot of lessons that we can draw from this system. And when I was there, my focus was largely on the terrestrial nematodes because they have some of the most interesting adaptations in order to survive extreme cold. So when we think of extreme cold and desiccation or a lack of water are intertwined. As water freezes, it becomes unavailable to organisms, and it also becomes deadly. Because when water freezes within organisms, for most organisms, that's the death knell. You have to have specialized adaptations in order to survive ice nucleation within your own body. So organisms through evolutionary time have been sort of pushed to answer this question. Are you going to tolerate freezing, or are you going to avoid freezing? So that's kind of a question you can sort of ask yourself for kind of any animal in any system. Are they going to tolerate freezing, or are they going to avoid freezing? So most organisms have to avoid freezing because they can't tolerate it. And there's very few organisms on our planet that have truly avoided that freeze tolerance. Nematodes are some of the most freeze tolerant organisms on our planet. And they can go so far as to enter a state that is not only absent metabolism, but almost absent body water, which is something that's thought to be, the antithesis of life. So on the right here, we see a coiled nematode that's shown in a scanning electron micrograph. So very, very focused in, highly magnified, of a famous Antarctic nematode, not a dry valley nematode, but a peninsular nematode called Panaglorimus. And they also undergo this adaptation where they basically freeze dry themselves. And they slowly, somewhat slowly, evaporate water loss until they can turn on certain genes that provide them cryoprotectant molecules. So that was one of my goals in studying these nematodes, was to try to understand some of the genes that are involved in these adaptations that allow them to persist for sometimes 11 or more months of the year in this sort of anhydrobiotic state, which meaning life without water. So these pictures are from microscope photos that I took. On the left side, you see living Antarctic nematodes, Plectus antarcticus, in culture. And then on the right, they've been induced to undergo anhydrobiosis. So one of the things I had to do in graduate school was figure out how to rear Antarctic nematodes in Colorado, and then also how to make them go into and mimic the Antarctic conditions that would make them go into anhydrobiosis, and then do molecular biology to try to understand the genetic expression that underlies some of those adaptations. And what's interesting in these organisms is there's sugars involved. One sort of thing you'll notice is we talk a lot about often the protective molecules that are involved in freeze tolerance have some connection to sugar. And that's the case here, but it's interestingly not glucose or glycerol or something like that. In nematodes, or at least in these Antarctic nematodes, it seems to be a sugar that's called trehalose, which is sort of a derivative of glucose, but it has to undergo some sort of chemical reactions in order to change it from those, in between those chemical forms. So this is a cryoprotectant molecule that doesn't seem to be found in some of the larger taxa that are seem to be freeze tolerant, like some of the insects and some of the even the vertebrates like the frogs that we will touch on a bit later. So kind of some interesting reveal on the mechanisms here. And one other thing that we were able to discover through this study was some of the proteins that are involved in turning on some of these mechanisms. And that's a really interesting application. One of the genes that's involved in turning on this anhydrobiotic state, which is you could think of as a suspended animation state, where the cells are alive but not doing anything. And they're almost imperceptibly alive. You would only really know if these cells are alive if you add water, and then these organisms spring back to life. Some of the protein genes that are involved in this in nematodes are also present in human beings. So makes you wonder about tumor suppression, perhaps. Are there connections here that could be valuable for understanding human diseases? So it shows that, you know, things that we glean from one system often have wide-ranging applications that go beyond the system in question. Okay, so when we talk about polar places, I just, of course, want to not forget the Arctic. Usually people forget Antarctica, so I want to make sure that we don't forget about the Arctic, a really important polar place to the north. So here we're looking kind of at a top-down view of our planet. If you're looking kind of at the North Pole, which is kind of a different view than we usually see, this is what's often called the whole Arctic view of our planet. And this is kind of just an interesting kind of twist of point of view, but also it's a tie-in to thinking about the ice age, right? The Pleistocene that largely grew out of the Arctic. So this is a common view to think about sort of that period of our planet. And, you know, it's good to kind of work in just one little thing that I like to talk about is you're probably maybe surprised that we've gotten this far in a talk talking about Antarctica and we haven't talked about these guys and gals yet. Believe it or not, I spent almost 3 months in Antarctica, never saw a penguin up close. I only saw a penguin from a helicopter because they don't live where I was doing research. They're in the summertime, they're off the coast in kind of coastal islands in their rookeries. So not close to where I was herding my worms. And it's also important to remember that the Arctic and the Antarctic have very different animals. They're separated in evolutionary time by a great distance because Antarctica and the Arctic, well, even though the Arctic isn't really a continent, right? But the area around the North Pole, they were on two separate supercontinents, right? Gondwanaland went to the south and Laurasia stayed to the north. So the Arctic and the Antarctic have been separated by billions of years in their evolutionary development. So we don't have these in the Arctic, and there's also no polar bears on Antarctica. So that's an important distinction. You often see sort of polar animals depicted like they're having a party together. And that's great to think of in for cultural value, but it's not scientifically accurate, just to put that out there. Okay, so a couple things about water, because like I mentioned earlier, water and temperature, they're interconnected in so many different ways. And our planet would certainly not be like it is without the presence of this molecule. So water is special in all sorts of different ways. One of the main things that confers a lot of water special attributes is the fact that it has polar molecules, meaning one side of the molecules is sort of, they acts like a mini magnet, right? We've got one side of the molecule that's effectively positive and the other side negative. And that leads to a lot of interesting interactions between the water molecules themselves and also between water and other chemicals. So water has a lot of special properties. one of the most relevant to thinking about cold is the fact that ice floats. Most liquids become more dense as they freeze and become a solid. Water's pretty special. This curve is just meant to remind us that water is actually most dense at 4 degrees Celsius when it's liquid and cold. And as water promotes to freezing, it actually becomes less dense. So it's not trivial. Imagine if it were a different way, right? Imagine if ponds froze from the bottom up rather than the top down. Conditions would be really different than they are. That permits life to exist even in ponds and lakes where you have the lid of ice at the top, but you have this liquid fraction underneath. So there's many other properties of water that are allowed because of polar molecules, including capillary action, surface tension, right? Lots of unique things. And water can also take lots of different physical forms, right? Solid, liquid, and gas. But even within the solid form of water, right, you have lots of different solid forms of water. The wintry mix that we all love, right? Sleet, snow, ice chunks, hail, right? Those are all technically solid forms of water, but they're all very different. So, and even when snow falls, the snowpack itself becomes a really changeable environment where once the unique snowflakes fall and get deposited, pretty much as soon as that deposition happens, the snowpack starts to change in form. And one of the first things that happens is what's called destructive metamorphism, which is basically where you have, it's usually a very temporary situation where your snowpack's all the same temperature. And really why it's called destructive, what is it destructing? Well, it's destructing the snowflakes as the snowflakes start to form together, right? When that's happening, this is like when you want to go skiing, right? Right as this process is happening, because the snowpack hasn't kind of consolidated yet. And then as that snowpack sets up, you start to enter the next phase, which is constructive metamorphism. And that's where the snowpack is no longer the same temperature. And a snowpack is actually warmest at the bottom and coldest at the top. And when that happens, that causes a lot of changing conditions in the snowpack. It also creates a habitat for a lot of organisms. And then you have the other form that can happen at any time, which is melting, right? And these days, with it not being able to stay cold as much during winter, sometimes you get melt metamorphism right after deposition. So melt metamorphism can kind of cut in at any time to kind of disrupt the snowpack dynamics. And when that happens, you get really rapid melting of the snowpack because of how water works. As water freezes, it becomes a liquid to a frozen state of matter. A lot of heat gets released. And when that happens, the surrounding snowpack will change in form as a response to that influx of heat. If we consider snow as an environment for critters, constructive metamorphism is a benefit for them. As constructive metamorphism is happening, the water vapor is migrating upwards in the snowpack, and that's creating more brittle base at the base of the snowpack, and that's what we call depth hoar. Hoar is a type of like brittle ice. You can get hoar ice that forms at the surface and hoar ice that forms at the depth of the snowpack, and that's what we're talking about here. A concentration gradient of water is set up here, where water is migrating upward, where there's a lower concentration, and there's also a concentration or a gradient in temperature. So as water migrates upwards, you're losing mass in the lower area of the snowpack. That's bad news if you're a skier, right? That creates avalanche-like conditions where you have these unstable plates within the snow. If you're a subnivean animal, this is great. Depth hoar makes it easier to make tunnels. So this snowpack metamorphism is often, responded quickly by the subnivean animals, including quite a number of small mammals in our environment, including some of these cuties. Shrews, voles, and mice are some of the sort of famous herbivores that remain winter active in the subnivean environment. The snow offers them quite a bit of insulation. So quite a number of our small mammals that remain winter active inhabit this subnivean environment in order to take advantage of some of this insulative capability that the snowpack offers. And of course, there's quite a number of predators that rely on these subnivean animals in order to derive their wintertime energy. So a changing snowpack environment, a decreasing in the amount of snowpack is very consequential, not only for the subnivean animals, but also for the predators that hunt them, larger mammal predators, also avian predators. So this figure is really just meant to remind us of that. It's interesting to look at how much warmer it is in the depths of the snowpack. And closer to the surface of the snow, the temperature becomes so low, it's prohibitive for most of these life forms to sort of thermoregulate their temperature in a way that is efficient for them to persist. So if we lose that snowpack, we would change many of these population dynamics. So in addition to offering, high insulative capability, sort of low thermal transfer, snow's also highly reflective. And the fancy word for that has a high albedo, or ability to reflect incoming solar radiation. Snow-covered places and ice-covered places reflect the incoming solar radiation, and in doing so, they help moderate or stabilize the global average temperature, because that reflected radiation isn't going to be subjected to the greenhouse effect in the same way that absorbed radiation is sort of retained by the greenhouse gases. So a loss of snow has many consequential effects on a global scale and also on a local scale. So cold places at high latitude are cold largely because of things that are occurring on a planetary scale. I often say this to my college students. Of course, Earth is tilted on its axis, and that leads to the seasons that many of us love here at mid-latitude. But the poles would be cold whether or not Earth was tilted or not, because polar places receive a really shallow angle of solar input. So their solar budget is really modest to begin with. Here at mid-latitude, our solar budget really varies depending on the time of year. Here in New Hampshire, our solar budget about doubles when summertime comes. So winter solar input is far smaller than the summertime input. So this is a beautiful photo taken of some Harris Center lands looking out on Osgood Hill, and you can find the little black bear there in the foreground there. So the date of this picture was October. So presumably this bear is fattening up before wintertime. Some animals have that behavior, what we call hyperphagia, where they go and they just eat and try to fatten up before the seasons change. So that leads to maybe some of us to wonder about how do animals keep time? And mammals do it largely in their brain using a combination of the hypothalamus and the pineal gland, which is a gland that produces hormones. And they actually, most mammals rely on the perception of dark rather than the perception of light. So they actually don't, interestingly, perceive the shortening days, they perceive the lengthening nights. And that's what gives them the cue in order to start their preparations for seasonal wintertime arrival. So birds do a little bit differently, but that's how it tends to happen in most mammals. So in mid-latitude and dwelling animals where the seasonal change is really apparent, they have to sort of prepare for that. And in polar places, it's even more extreme, where, like I mentioned earlier, you have months where the sun never sets and months where the sun never rises. So coping with the cold more locally is usually could primarily be described by sort of 3 different categories, although there are many exceptions. So there's really no rules in ecology, there's guidelines. So this is a guideline, right? You migrate, you hibernate, or you deal, right? You persist or resist the temperatures. So migration is incredibly interesting, but we don't have time to talk about that tonight. But it's remarkable about how some organisms perceive that change and then choose to leave that environment. And the reasons why and how they leave that environment are extremely complex and interesting. Hibernation is a state where you could call this rose by a few other names: brumation if you're a reptile, or torpor in certain instances. Hibernation, loosely defined as a reduction in body temperature that comes from a reduction in metabolic activity. Although we can see there's loose definitions there, especially when you think about reptiles that are cold-blooded to begin with, right? So there's a lot of sort of fuzzy boundaries there. And then within the organisms that have to, plants can't just get up and move. They have to come up with mechanisms either by going dormant or by utilizing winter activity in order to survive in those places. And across all these categories, they all really involve a combination of physical, physiological, and behavioral adaptations. So for different organisms, there may be heavier relying on one area of those more than others. So to illustrate some of those fuzzy categories, some animals migrate in order to hibernate. So an area where an organism hibernates it's called its hibernaculum, or hibernacula if it's plural, right? So most New Hampshire bat species, for example, migrate to just a few caves in southern and central Vermont. And I just love this see no evil picture of this bat here. So it really illustrates the need for conservation of this specialized habitat that these organisms flee to when the temperatures drop. And presumably if they lost access to those environments, the survival of these populations would be at risk. Snake species, many snake species congregate during wintertime, and in some places they do so incredibly dramatically. This is a picture of famous red-sided garter snakes in Manitoba that congregate by tens of thousands in these caves. And then this picture is upon their emergence in the spring, and that's where they mate. So this is sort of what's called a mating ball. I guess no one was brave enough to take pictures in the cave, but this is what kind of gives you the impression of the Indiana Jones like snake pit that would be happening in this cave, which is remarkable to see. So hibernation is, historically at least, a term reserved to talk about homeotherms, or warm-blooded organisms. When they decrease their metabolic rate, that causes a reduction in their body temperature, and therefore they use less resources during that period of dormancy. Bears are interesting because for a while they weren't considered true hibernators because they only suppress their body temperature a few degrees. And they don't stay asleep in their den the whole winter. They're often in a kind of a sleepy state. But for example, they won't, if a bear biologist goes in and tries to tag them, they will rustle from their sleep. And you could also ask yourself, are you really hibernating if you're giving birth? Right? Black bears and polar bears and brown bears, I believe, all give birth to cubs during their winter inactive period. And for bears, a typical number of cubs is often at least 2. So the cubs are not inactive. So it's just one of those amazing things to think about. So bears, while we're thinking about them, they're a really interesting group of organisms to try to think about. One of the kind of the trends that we talk about in cold places or colder places is that, is it better to be bigger? And this is what's often called Bergman's rule, although not all animals conform to this rule. Something about 65-70% of animals do, though, conform to this rule, where at polar locations, the higher latitude locations, animals will tend to be larger than similar animals at lower latitude. So bears are a nice exemplification of this rule, where not that black bears are small, but the bear species tend to be larger as you go higher in latitude. So kind of one of those interesting trends that we see. And it's really, driven by metabolic rules, right? Larger organisms have a smaller surface to volume ratio, and therefore they would presumably radiate a little bit less heat. Another trend that we see in higher latitude places is pigmentation. In many organisms, birds and mammals especially, pigmentation is reduced in animals that are located at higher latitude. Although again, I'm sure you could think of plenty of exceptions to this rule. But it's one way that we use to explain, how you get so many white animals at high latitude. Of course, camouflage is a factor, but you would think that it would be better to be dark because you could absorb a lot of heat from the sun. But it turns out that absorption of heat is a double-edged sword. If you absorb a lot of heat from the sun, that means you're going to radiate a lot of that heat back because of the differential between your heat and the heat of the environment. So equilibrium will dictate that you actually lose a lot of that heat. And that makes it more difficult for your body to moderate those changes in temperature. White fur and white feathers is really due to the absence of the pigment or reduction in the pigment melanin. And when the pigment melanin is missing, you suddenly have air spaces in the fur and the feathers from where the melanin was present. And that actually offers a secondary benefit where those air spaces offer some insulation value to the organisms. So this ermine or long-tailed weasel that was snapped by James Shapiro, presumably somewhere here in New England in April, is just sort of fascinating to think about some of these things we've been talking about. Some animals are locked into their color for their whole lifetime, and then some animals are plastic, right, where they switch their coloration throughout the year. So the weasels are a great example of how they're changing coloration to probably take advantage of some of the thermogenic benefits, but also some of the camouflage benefits as well. And nothing in evolution, there's no one size fits all approach. There's a lot of evolutionary constraints that lead to a lot of trade-offs, and unfortunately for the organisms, no perfect solutions. Okay, I'm going to finish up here soon, but I can't finish up without talking about, if there is a near perfect local resident for winter, this might be it, right? We are really lucky to live where we do for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons is we have some of the most magical wizards of freeze tolerance just right in our backyards. We have 3 of the 4 land hibernating frogs in the woods around us. So these are frogs that hibernate in the leaf litter, and they're capable of tolerating freezing because they make their own specialized antifreeze. So these pictures here are of wood frogs, which is of the most of the well-studied, but spring peepers and also gray tree frogs are also capable of doing similar things in order to cope with the onset of winter. So these frogs overwinter in the leaf litter, so they don't have much protection from the changing temperatures in the air above, other than the snowpack that's above them. So they're, much like the subnivean animals, very sensitive to snowpack decline. And in these organisms, the ice formation in the tissues actually promotes the response where the liver catalyzes glycogen into glucose and floods the frog system with massive amounts of sugar, something like 200 times the normal blood sugar levels of this frog. So interesting way to think about it is the frogs become incredibly diabetic for a short period of time, and that sugar offers a cryoprotection mechanism where it protects kind of the core, and believe it or not, the frog kind of lets some of their tissues freeze, especially in the interstitial spaces. Wood frogs can tolerate something on the order of 65% of their body mass being frozen. The heartbeat gets really rapid in response to the initial onset of the freezing, and then about 20 hours after it starts, the heartbeat stops. And the heartbeat stops all winter until it warms up, until it rains, and then these frogs can magically reanimate within 6 or so hours, and they can literally hop away and go on to mating. So if you have ever participated in a salamander or frog crossing brigade, you have been handling some of these organisms that have just awoken from this wintertime slumber and are already kind of moving and hopping and on their way just a few hours after they have gotten their heart started to beat quite again. It's just fascinating. It really makes you ask a lot of questions about what it means to be alive, and what it means to be alive at such a time that we get to be lucky enough to interact with these awesome organisms. So there's many other cool stories I could tell you and that I would love to tell you, but I want to leave time for questions. And one thing I'll mention is, if this has whet your appetite for more stories about winter, I'm teaching a Cheshire Academy for Lifetime Learning course that starts next Thursday. And it's 4 weeks. So it's little vignettes about winter. So the email here to inquire about registering, I put here. There's a course fee for that class, but it's very minimal. I think it's $25. So if you want to learn more about that course, feel free to email the continuing ed folks or ask me any questions you have about it. This was so fun. I just want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank my Harris Center colleagues for everything y'all have done for me this past year, and big ups to my family who really helped me out with so many things, especially while I've had my broken ankle last month. So thank you, everybody. And now I'd love to take your questions.
Fantastic. Great job. Yeah, I'll go backwards from where we ended up. There were some questions coming in about deer. Someone was wondering about deer, which are, large mammals that don't hibernate and survive through the cold winters. And I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, deer are really interesting because they they persist. They, like you mentioned, they don't hibernate, and they also don't exhibit those like hyperphagia behaviors like bears do. They don't overeat and then try to live off fat stores. So deer are also penned in by their legs, right? They don't have very long legs. So that's why in the wintertime, they get really restricted to what we call deer yards, right? Which are these areas often underneath coniferous forests where the snowpack is shallower. And that's what leads to these, population density levels where there's often not enough good forage and browse for those deer. And that's where we see the deer population health start to really decline because of wintertime stress and all the what comes from those dense population areas of the deer. So deer pretty much, their winter survival strategy is just eat. And so they use what we call non-shivering thermogenesis, where deer, they have piloerection, they get the goosebumps. But other than that, it's not like a bird where if you watch a bird in the wintertime, like a chickadee, they're pretty much just shivering constantly in order to keep their body temperature up. Deer can't do that as much. So it's pretty much eat or die.
Nice. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Pat was asking, have our warmer winters where we often get ice on top of snow increased morbidity or I think mortality among critters such as rough grouse who take shelter under the snow, but then can't break through the ice when they try to emerge?
Absolutely. That the change in snowpack dynamics are having effect on all sorts of different organisms, grouse, and also organisms like owls that often kind of hunt critters through the snow, and they have a harder time if there's an ice crust there. They have a much harder time breaking through that. So the more kind of intermittent thaw periods, and Brett asked a question like, what did I wish I would have gotten to? Well, one of the main kind of consequences of climate change that's detrimental around here is those sorts of changes to the snowpack, and also how it disrupts a lot of the typical thaw periods that we have. So you put all that together, and it's a lot of kind of disruption of a lot of the typical cycles that we have. And the ecological change is happening on such a rapid pace where the evolutionary change is struggling to keep up.
Someone asked about wood frogs. How long can they remain frozen? Is there a...
I mean, I don't know if it's ever been tested, like, could they just stay in forever? I mean, I think when they're in that state, it's probably unlimited. I mean, I know people have reanimated, I can't say for frogs, but I know people have reanimated nematodes from museum samples of moss that's like 200 years old. So the thinking is that when the animals are in the suspended state, that they're not really aging, right? So unless there's something, a predator event or another a trauma that happens when they're in that persistent state, as long as they kind of experience the warm-up conditions as they typically would, I would think that they could probably persist in that state for quite some time.
Very cool. And then going back to Antarctica, someone asked about plants. Aren't there plants in other parts of Antarctica? Maybe not where you were, but
there's Antarctica has recently gotten its first dandelion, but that's in the peninsular region of Antarctica. So the kind of the arm that sticks up towards South America. So there are some plants that have started to colonize that area. And right now they're still considered invasive species, but if you rewind the evolutionary clock long enough, everything's an invasive species. So, will we see a time where plants recolonize Antarctica? Yes. Then the question just becomes, how far will they be able to persist? What plants are they? And then how will they affect that ecosystem? It will be dramatic change, which will probably be to the benefit of some organisms and probably to the extinction of others.
And then I was wondering about the construction of those camps. How did they, what is the logistics of getting that material into Antarctica? You were commuting by helicopter. I can't imagine.
Yes. I mean, I would say at any given time, there's like in the summertime at the height of the season, there's maybe 200 scientists down there, and there's about 1,000 individuals of the support staff. So the support staff is huge by comparison, and without them, none of the science would happen. So there's an incredible, I mean, just the resources that go into it, and it's, you know, I'm so grateful to have gotten to do that as part of my education.
That's fantastic. We had a couple follow-up questions to the frozen frogs. Have you studied the brain activity of frogs while they're in cryo?
I have not. I know other people have, and they don't have brain activity, amazingly. It's not detectable. They, you know, much like bottom of pond hibernating frogs, they kind of enter this state of suspended animation, where if anything, you know, in some pond dwelling turtles, hibernating turtles, they can detect some anaerobic respiration, but in the wood frogs themselves, they're sort of, they really truly are, you know, ametabolic by any sort of typical definition. So it really does stretch the definition of a lot of our notions of what is a deceased organism and what's a living organism. And then somebody asked what keeps their brain alive. Well, the interesting thing is the brain is dormant, so it isn't needing any energy. So there isn't that need to feed the brain during that time.
We have I think our last question, which is, how do you think the Harris Center is well positioned to study these issues? And that's a loaded question.
Yeah, that is a loaded question. I mean, I mostly, there's a lot of, I didn't talk about them as much tonight, but they're, even though they're closer, we touched on it with a little bit with the amphibians, there's as many interesting adaptations in local organisms, some of them more well studied than others. So I think the Harris Center is well positioned to sort of, you know, of course, be more of an ecosystem and higher level focus, but nonetheless, you know, without the habitat, these organisms can't persist anywhere. So that's the most important thing, is to think about, you know, the conservation of their habitats, which allows us the time to study some of the fascinating adaptations. Because if we lose their habitat, then we potentially lose the organisms, and then the secrets they hold are lost forever.
All right. Well, it's 6:30 now. Karen, thank you so much. If we were, you know, in a room together, we would get a standing ovation.
Thank you. It
was
was
a
so
fantastic
fun.
presentation.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody for attending tonight and learning about weathering the winter weather.
Thank you all so much. It was so fun. And if you have other questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat. And if you ever have any questions about weird winter things, let me know. Thank you.